Welcome to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, the elements of style. What is style? What does it mean for comics? How does an artist choose a style and develop it? And then what do they do when the time has come to change it? First up, a special interview with comic artist Braden Hallett, creator of the comic Cato's Apprenticeship. Then we'll have a discussion with some creators from the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Christina Major of the comic Sombulus will be with us, along with Ally Rom Colthoff of the comic Chirault and Robin Childs of the comic LeyLines. It's all about art and communication in this episode, so stay with us.
Hello and welcome to the first episode. I'm Eva, and one comic that I've been reading for the last few years, and that has been on my list of favorites for the last few years, is Cato's Apprenticeship. It's set in a world where humanity clings to small pockets of space-borne air and water, and a modest family cargo ship, the Grimalkin, trades between the last islands of humanity, doing its best to survive. And Cato is our young protagonist, living on that ship out in space. And one early Friday morning I interviewed the author of Cato's Apprenticeship, Braden Hallett, and I started off by asking him about how this comic began. I think you started it as a NaNoWriMo novel. Did you intend to adapt it into a comic later on, or did you decide that after?
I kind of decided it after. It actually started in first year university as a 20-page short story, and then I turned that into a 20-page kids book for my education class, and then I turned that into the NaNoWriMo novel, and then I needed something for a webcomic to force me to draw every few days, so I thought, it's a script, it's there, it means I don't have to write anything else.
How did you get the idea for the story?
I'm not too sure, actually. Honestly enough, I just kind of started writing for the class, and then I've added little bits as time has gone by. I don't know. Inspiration-wise, I think subconsciously I'm just trying to fit as many science fiction tropes that I saw growing up, if you get what I mean. Like references to science fiction shows and stuff like that. Star Wars, Firefly, a lot of video game references to like Super Metroid, Star Fox, that kind of thing.
You decided to turn it into a webcomic, but were you drawing comics before that, or is it your first one?
It is my first one.
I see. I can tell how, because you seem to be using your comic a lot for experimentation and for figuring out how you want to draw comics.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. I think for one or two chapters I've tried to keep things fairly consistent, but for the most part, yeah, it's very, today I feel like doing it this way kind of thing. Like, I never ever intended it to be sold or published or anything like that. It was purely to get better at art.
Oh, why did you decide to do that with webcomics? Because you have a DeviantArt and you draw a lot, it seems, so...
I do have a DeviantArt, I do draw a lot, but with comics, with webcomics particularly, people will only read your comic for the most part if you stick to a publishing deadline. And I knew that if I didn't force myself into a schedule, then I just wouldn't draw. Like if it was, I think I'll do some character art today, or I think I'll do a request today, I'd only do 1 or 2 drawings a week. Whereas if I have to do 2 to 3 pages a week, then I'm working on something every day. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get in as many hours in front of my tablet as possible. So I thought that was the best way to do it with a webcomic.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, people saying that if you want to learn how to draw or if you want to improve, then you should start a webcomic. But I'm not really sure about that, because from my experience, it's very easy to just stick to what is easy, specifically because you have to pump out a page after page after page.
I don't know. I was always told that it doesn't matter, for the most part, it doesn't matter what you're doing, as long as you're just doing a lot of it. Like, when it comes to mastering a skill, you need to get 10,000 hours in, and as long as you're just doing it, you'll get there eventually.
So, of all the styles that you used in your comic, I think the one I liked the most was in chapter 6, where it was just a lot of black and white. It seemed to really suit your comic because it's set in space, and when I see photographs from space, it just tends to be these stark shadows that are completely black, and also the spaces that are lit tend to be lit very brightly, so it just seemed like, yeah, this is space, this looks like space to me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you know what? I never really thought of that. You're talking about the book 1, chapter 6, right? The one in the... Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, I guess you're right. It is very space-like, like that, with the black and white stark contrast. I had never thought of that. That's kind of one of my favorite chapters too, actually, and I couldn't have said why, but that's a really good reason.
So your inks are really, really good, and I like them a lot. So what are your secrets?
That is a good question. I don't know. For the first little while with my inks, I tried to focus on slowing down and taking as much time as possible and making really fluid, simple lines and trying not to erase too much or like really ever. And then later on, I got more into making one quick fluid stroke and then creating a whole new layer for the next stroke and then going back and cleaning it up. And now I'm back to doing like just really quick fluid lines. Sometime I'll invite you to like one of the art streams I do and you can take a look at how I do it. But I don't think I really have any secrets particularly. It's just alter the line weight once in a while, and yeah, no, I don't even think about it, I just do it.
Maybe I'm just too used to a very coloring book style inking because of coloring everything all the time. But when you ink a page, when you know that you will be coloring it, do you approach it differently or not?
I used to. When I first started coloring, I found that the easiest way to make sure that I could quickly color the line art was to make sure every single line intersected, so I would have continuous solid shapes just to fill. And I did that for a while, like a month or a year, I guess. And I found it was really hard to avoid making line tangents, if you get what I mean, like having the line work look muddy because too many things were intersecting. And then I came across a different method to keep the line art more like it was in the beginning of the comic and still be able to fill in all the layers easily, which I don't know what program you use, but I don't use Photoshop, and so I haven't been able to use any tutorials, really. I use a program called Corel Painter, and there's pretty much nothing in the way of tutorials for the program. So a lot of the changes in my art have come from me kind of stumbling across a new method of doing something, like discovering a new button I'd never seen before that made things significantly easier.
I am surprised to hear that you don't approach it differently, because when I think of people who are good at inking, I tend to think that they have a really strong sense that this will be seen as inks only. And so, of course, when you know that you'll be coloring, you'll be doing it completely differently. So it's interesting that you don't do that.
Yeah, now I don't do it differently. I just ink like I always used to. I don't approach it differently at all.
How do you come up with new ways to do things? Because you do experiment so much in your comic. So how do you come up with something new, and how do you approach doing something new, something you haven't done before?
Well, when it came to inks, I think my approach to trying something new was just to try out a different brush each page. And if I liked a brush, I kind of stuck with it for a little while, and then I'd try something else. Like if you look at the inks in the early chapters, I think I was using a calligraphy pen tool. And then I just kind of went through the brush category and tried every single pen tool I could, and I settled on a new one, and I've used that one ever since. But when it comes to coloring, I'll just play around with different brushes every once in a while. I'll go into like the oil paint brushes and try those, and then I'll go into the glazing brushes and try those. And I just spend maybe an hour or so every other day just trying out new stuff with different layers, and sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised. I don't have any special way of trying new things. I just grab a random brush I haven't tried and go.
Hearing that, I just think, wow, and you publish a page that you created for experimentation like that. It almost seems like sacrilege to me to not consistently stick to one thing and one thing only.
I guess so. I don't think the changes I make are so drastic that it's sacrilege, as you said, but I guess it's all in the name of mastering the program, right? So if you don't try new things, then you'll never discover much about it. Like even if I was using Photoshop, I think I'd probably just play around with a lot of things to see what they do, because there's just so many buttons, so many menus.
At this point, I would just go for all the existential questions, like, why draw at all?
Why draw? Because it's fun.
Don't you find it frustrating, though? I don't know, maybe it's just me trying to strive for creating true art and somehow not knowing how to get there.
All the time. But I don't know, I think the good outweighs the bad. I'll have days where I look at the stuff that I'm doing and I think it's garbage, but honestly enough, those days are coming fewer and further between. Like that's one of the reasons I use the webcomic for experimentation. Is one of the other things just drawing every day does is it makes you realize that the majority of the stuff you make is actually not bad, right? If you only do one drawing a week, you'll look at what you've created and just see what's wrong with it. But if you draw 7 things a week, you'll just notice the improvement you're making. So yeah, why do it at all? Because it is fun. That's about it, actually. I just enjoy doing it.
Well, that was a great interview. And to discuss it a little bit further, we have some members of our collective here who are going to be talking about style, artwork, and the comics that we're all working on. With us today, we have Christina Major.
Hi, how's it going?
We have Ally Rom Colthoff.
Hello.
And we have Robin Childs.
Hello.
So one of the items that they brought up most in the interview was about style, developing a style, and then changing a style. And style is one of these things that sort of, it means anything to anybody. It means whatever anybody wants it to mean, depending on what conversation they were having. But in terms of comics, it means something very specific, which is sort of the feel of your comic and what you're going to get out of it, what it's going to feel like when you read it. So how then do you develop a style in the first place? And in particular, in terms of your own experiences here, how did you develop a style? Do you have what you consider to be a style? And did you go into it in an organic way, or did it just sort of happen the way it happened for Braden, which was that he seemed to be trying to learn how to develop a comic and his style sort of developed for him as he went along?
Yeah, I loved the interview with Braden. He definitely touches on some stuff I've experimented with. I do a comic called Sombulus, which is a world-hopping adventure story about a girl who talks to machines, a paladin and a magician, and they travel to different worlds. And every time they go someplace new, the style of the art will change. And that was a very deliberate decision for me. So I really resonated with how Braden treated that.
Ally, what do you think?
Stylistically speaking, I feel like my comic definitely evolved very organically. I never made a serious attempt to switch styles throughout. I've been, I guess, trying to keep it consistent insofar as that's possible over 9 years. I do a fantasy comic called Chirault about a kid who gets shrunk down to be super tiny and then falls into a magical conspiracy. But I started off doing comics inspired by manga and comics like Bone and ElfQuest. So I think when I started drawing as a kid, I was kind of inspired by that like aesthetic, and that just kind of is kept like very gradually evolving as I keep drawing.
And Robin?
I think that for me, my style is still in progress because it's not something I think about much. I just am trying to always improve what I'm doing and become better at just art and the craft of comics. So what people have perceived as my style, I know people say, oh, you have such a unique style. And so they're like, well, I'm self-taught. So yeah, that doesn't shock me. But I don't know, couldn't tell you what my style is because it changes all the time. And part of that, I think, is just to keep it fresh for me. Because if I'm trying to keep everything fully consistent all the time, I already know I get bored. Because on my first project, which was Shades of Grey, which was an angsty teen story I started when I was 15, and I did that for 8 years. When I hit the 6 or 7 year mark, I was so burned out of my own comic, and I really wanted to finish it. but I didn't know how I could keep going with my current art style, so I just decided to change it drastically. I was entering into a period of the comic where everyone was going into a different dream. So I thought, oh, okay, yeah, I'll just make it into a different dream. And there was a pretty negative reader reaction to that, actually, because people had really gotten used to this one style. No one really wrote to me very often, but they wrote to me about that. So I knew people were upset. And it was one of those things where just sort of like, well, I'm sorry that you are upset that the style has changed, but I have to do this for me, because otherwise I'm not going to be drawing it. And it was such a relief to be doing different styles. I tried out extreme, simplified shapes, black and white, really stark contrasts, watercolor painting, bits of color, and it was all over the place. But I learned so much about different kinds of mediums that way that I really wanted to incorporate it into new projects. But I didn't want the backlash from readers. So in LeyLines, which is my current project, which is about 3 siblings that are on the run after a conspiracy claims their mother's life, and they end up getting wrapped up in the schemes of gods instead. I have different powers, and every time someone uses a different power, I use a different art style. And I introduced those really, really early on in the story because I wanted them to be incorporated. And now it's a totally different reaction from the readers because it's like, oh, I love this kind of page. I love these kinds of pieces. So people look forward to seeing the different styles rather than reacting negatively to them.
I think that's a very interesting point. The comic that I do is called Six Commando, which is a science fiction military comic, very different from the kind of things that a lot of other people do and somewhat more rarefied. And from the very start, I was trying to make it look like animation. Not really animation in the sense that it should be animated or that it was cells, but sort of a very hard, high contrast color. And originally when I started working on my comic, I did it all by hand and drew it by hand in pencil and ink and then scanned it and then did this color on top of it. And so my style sort of developed as I went. I've been doing it for about 7 years now, so it's had some time to mature, but most of the experimentation happened on the early end of it, and now the experimentation that I do is somewhat subtler. But something that you said, Robin, really I found interesting, the idea that there was a sort of a reaction to it when you changed something that was established versus something that you establish early in your style as a direction that you're going to go with it, and then move forward with that. Because of the idea of expectations, do you feel that I'd like to ask this of Christina and Ally, do you feel that people have a certain expectation of the style that they're going to expect from you now? Do you feel like that guides the direction that you take it now?
I started Sombulus as black and white, and my first big style change was to go to color. And I think that that's the kind of style change where nobody's going to complain. People love the color comics. I think my work is stronger in color. And so people absolutely 100% thought, oh my gosh, this is cool. And I was able to work it into the story, like I said, because they're magically going to different places. They're opening portals and going into different places, very similar to how LeyLines does it. You have an understanding of this is why this is happening in the story. So I think that's the way you want to do it. Now, they went to this color place and then they came back to a black and white world, and people weren't so keen on that. They were like, oh, okay, I understand why this is happening, but your color pages were really better. And a lot of my stylistic choices were also about time, and I've always been very open and cognizant about that because webcomics are not a sprint, they're a marathon. Some people have it all down and they'll get it out in 2 years or whatever, but I don't. I'm going to be working on this for years and years. And I knew, like Robin knew with Shades of Grey, that I was going to hate it just going on forever on the same style. I knew that my life was going to be changing. If I got different jobs or I moved to different places, I might have more or less time. And I just wanted that freedom within my work to say, okay, I need a simpler style right now because I'm working 10-hour days and I can't do a full color page right now. So they're going to go someplace where things are easier and I can kind of ease into that. Or I just got Manga Studio and I really want to learn how to use it, but I don't know all the tools yet. So I'm going to start with an easier style. That's how Act 3 kind of came about because that was my first time using Manga Studio. And I wanted to see, okay, I don't know these tools. this is the first tool I found, that's going to be the style, and I'm going to gradually work up to different things. But yeah, so there's a lot of different reasons. I'm very transparent about it, and I think my readers respond positively to that.
How about you, Ellie? I know that you have a fairly established style at this point, and you've generally used a much more limited palette than a lot of others in your work. How do you feel that that's, or do you feel that that has grown up to produce some sort of expectation of the people who read your comic?
I think it definitely has, and in a way, the limited palette and the set of tools that I use have kind of defined the style that my comic has fallen into, more so maybe than the actual way in which I draw. Like if I changed mediums and went to digital, probably people would interpret that as a change of style, even if I was actually drawing the characters in the same way as before. So in that sense, I feel like sticking to like the markers and the brush pen, I can keep evolving like my drawing skills and the types of things that I draw without making it look like it's a different work or like a different world that the characters are living in. So in that sense, I guess my style is kind of defined by the medium, which is a bit freeing because I can practice new techniques and things like that, and it still feels consistent with the rest of the comic.
Well, that's definitely an interesting point, and the idea that the medium that you're using really does affect your style to a great extent, especially for you, because you work in traditional media. I worked in traditional media and transitioned into digital. Christina, I think you've been working in digital media all the way through. Am I correct?
When I was first experimenting with Sombulus, I just used whatever I could get my hands on. I started with crappy felt tip markers that I stole from the supply closet at work. And then I scanned them in and colored them with Photoshop, and then I tried doing vector shapes with my mouse in Illustrator. Don't do that. It sucks. Anybody listening, don't do that. And then someone was very kind and got me a Wacom tablet, and that's what I've stuck with ever since.
And Robin, I would imagine your earlier work had traditional media in it, or have you been working in digital media all the way through?
My early work was fully by hand, and currently I use a mix. So all my pencils and inks are done by hand. I have a fully inked style, and then the dream style I do fully penciled, so it's a lot of pencil shading. But all the colors I do digitally, so it's still a half, 1 foot in one world, 1 foot in the other.
You know, another element that I've been thinking about as we've been talking, it's something I think we all come up on probably earlier in your career in artwork rather than later, is style as something that you sort of fall back on. I know that a lot of people I've talked to who are sort of early on, I don't get asked a lot, but on occasion I do get asked for, it's like, what do you think of this? Is this any good? Obviously a difficult question to answer, not probably a question that's ultimately impossible to answer, but people who sort of fall back on that, well, I don't want to change that, that's my style. I think that that's a very interesting element of it as well. Have you ever reached that point where you didn't want to change something because you felt that it was inherent to your style? And to what extent do you think that that is something that can really limit you after a while, especially if you're still developing as an artist? You don't really have a grasp of some things that you might like if you were able to do them, or if you wanted to try them out, you just sort of fall back on it. Oh, that's my style. I'm not changing that.
I think that when people say that, especially about styles that they adopted like very early, like as kids or teens, there's definitely some parts of styles people can choose that might break the rules of anatomy sometimes, like very stylized figures and things. And those styles can be really cool. There have been a lot of great like cartoons and professionally printed comics that use styles like that, but they have to have their own internal consistent rules that they follow in order to make the characters feel like they still have weight and they're still recognizable from panel to panel. And when you start breaking those things down, it becomes really hard for readers to follow, and it becomes harder to defend as a stylistic choice. I feel like there is a difference between when somebody is making their art look weird or askew as an intentional style, and when they're just covering for like a lack of understanding of perspective and anatomy. And that second thing is something that everybody should work on, like constantly, because it can be very distracting, or it can take away from the ability of your readers to empathize with your characters if, like, for instance, your expressions are always kind of stale or off or like too extreme or not conveying what you want them to. Since art is a tool of communication, above all else, you want your art to communicate what you want it to. And if what you think is your style is hurting that, you might want to change it.
I love that emphasis on art is communication, because that is so key to the conversation about, especially for comics, where you are trying to convey a story, you're trying to communicate a story. I just think that's beautifully put.
Yeah. I mean, I come from a graphic design education, and in graphic design, you really get used to making artistic decisions based on how the target audience feels. And that's kind of my approach to analyzing stylistic goals in comic art as well. You can take a look at something like XKCD, which makes a very deliberate stylistic choice to be stick figures, which is the closest you can come to being artistically invisible without being completely confusing. The stick figures are only there to indicate that a person is talking to another person. You don't care who these people are. They could be anyone. You don't want to put them in a setting. They could be any place. And that's a valid and very effective stylistic decision that makes XKCD more universal and entirely reliant on the power of the writing. But most of us don't want our characters to be faceless entities existing in a void. So we build the environments and make our first stylistic choices based on what we know and how our art makes us feel and our skill level. But how you embrace or reject those decisions as you go, in my mind, is getting to know your target audience, getting feedback, feeling out what's immersing them in the story, and like Ally said, what's distracting from it, and then clipping away the distracting things that are turning people away from the experience you want to convey.
It actually really frustrates me when people do this defensively, the "it's just my style" as a defense, because what I hear is, I don't want to learn. I don't want to question what I'm doing. I don't want to grow. Because it's not like you have to do that forever. You know, someone says your anatomy is really off, I really recommend looking at, doing some live drawing. And someone says, well, that's just my style. Well, I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to do that work. But I don't know, try it out. Try out some live drawing. Or there's so many programs online that are, there's free reference, free posing, that kind of stuff. Just to see what you can learn. Because if you want to learn and then come back and go, okay, I know that anatomy-wise this isn't right, but I just really like it, I want to keep doing that, that's at least an informed choice. And chances are good that you'll be better at drawing. Like Ally said, there are rules. It has to be internally consistent. When you come back after learning about whatever it was that you were recommended to learn about, you're probably going to be better at doing quote-unquote your style than you were before, because you'll know how to make it work for more people. So for me, it's just a huge frustration when people reject constructive criticism of any sort with, well, that's just my style. I understand not wanting to deal with unsolicited critique, and that's a whole different issue. But if you're hearing something over and over again, maybe owe it to yourself to do that. Take a hard look at what you're doing and try to improve, because you might find something really cool in there and become a better artist in the process. You can always go back.
You might find that you enjoy it as well. There's a lot to enjoy about developing your style and developing as an artist, not just the product at the end looking a certain way, but being open to what some of the process might have to teach you along the way. I like that point that you make, Robin, because it is about learning. It's about having a desire to learn as part of the process of doing a comic. And to touch again on something that Braden said in the interview, that he was drawing his comic, Cato's Apprenticeship, as a way of learning how to draw a comic. And there was a lot to like about that. I think there was a lot to enjoy about that. I personally, professionally, I work in design, but I had never tried to draw a comic before Sixth Commando. And I had all of various ideas floating around, and a friend of mine just said, just pick one and do it. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but at least it'll be something for you to do that will teach you a lot every week. And there's something to be said for sitting down and doing it and being open to the idea that change will happen over time just from practicing and trying to learn the rules that go into making something just at a very basic level. I think that's a very good point.
Well, there's so much craft. I've been doing this a decade now, and I'm still every single time learning so much more, learning how much more there is to learn about how to make comics well. It's odd that we're having this conversation today because I've been going through chapters 10 and 11 of LeyLines to prepare them for my 4th book. And there's so much I have to fix because I'm like, I've learned so much about how the tails on word balloons work. And now I have to fix all of these tails on all of these word balloons because otherwise they're terrible. And it's just little things like that where you're going to learn just by doing. And I didn't know, a year and a half ago what I know now. Now I can fix it. But undoubtedly in another year I'll look back and go, what was I thinking? And it'll be on something else entirely.
The point about coming to enjoy the process of just practicing and honing your craft is also pretty good, because when I started my comic, I was not in any art programs or anything. And since the beginning, I've taken some programs and things. So I have had some education now, but at the time that I started, I was just kind of winging it completely. And all the little things that I knew I needed to get better at, initially I rarely drew backgrounds and I would just leave things white behind the characters. And some early critiques of my stuff were like, I'm losing a sense of where the characters are because the background of the panel is just completely blank. And I was like, I guess I need to get better at drawing backgrounds, but that doesn't sound like something that's a ton of fun. There's no people in it. But I started doing landscape studies and I found that I actually really love it. And I've been doing landscape paintings every year for the last 4 or 5 years. And that's kind of become a thing that I do on its own now, completely separate from the comic, just because I enjoyed it so much. It all kind of spun out of wanting to get better at backgrounds.
I had a really similar experience. For me, it was discovering cinematography and learning about how to frame a scene and direct the eye, because I used to hate backgrounds with a passion. And then once I found how I could tell a story with them, now I really love doing them. So it's interesting we came to a similar place from different directions, but because of the same critique. Because I was getting the same, you're just using gradients. I'm okay. It makes me think of Jordan, who does hominids. I remember at a panel that he and I were on, someone asked him, how do I get better at doing, insert whatever. I don't remember what the thing they were asking for. And he just turned to him and he said, do the thing you hate until you find a way to love it. That's the way to get good at it.
That's good advice. I know myself, the way I built Sombulus, they go to a new world, the art will change, the art has to change. And I use it as an opportunity to try new tools because I am not on the bleeding edge of technology. I'm not the person who's downloading all the new brushes and textures. I hate that stuff. If I don't force myself to switch things up, I'm just going to keep scratching away with the felt tip pens that I stole from the office indefinitely. So yeah, I have to do that. I'm so glad I did that because I've learned so much. I've tried techniques that I loved. I've tried techniques that I hated. And I've sort of got it mapped out for myself now so that when I want to make a story that has a consistent look, I know which tools I like and which tools I'm good at. And that all really stemmed from being honest with the kind of person I was.
I've got the Bob Ross remix that's stuck in my head all of a sudden going, we don't make mistakes. We just have happy accidents.
Oh, man.
It's interesting that you mentioned Bob Ross, though, because I play Bob Ross shows in the background when I'm working. And I really think that there's something to that. Not everything needs to be a masterpiece, but there's something to be said for having a set of techniques at hand that will do a certain set number of things for you. And then being willing to build on that. To be satisfied with what you're doing is good. But also, I personally believe very strongly that art is kind of a struggle. And some of the best things that I've done, the quality of my comic, I like to think is consistently pretty good, but it's not anywhere near as high as I would like it to be. And that sort of keeps me wanting to be better. It's, to have an opportunity to do all of the details that I want to draw. Sometimes I just don't have the time, as I try to update once a week, and I work a full day job. But the idea is thinking of it as an opportunity, like how much can you put in rather than how much can you avoid having to do. And I think that's an interesting way of coming at it. And it certainly develops in people's styles as they move forward with them, as they develop them into something more refined. Definitely, I think my style has gotten more refined over time, just naturally as I've tried to spend more time each week doing things that I really want to do, and just seeing it as something that I really want to be doing every week, I think has helped me a lot.
I think the time aspect of comics is important too, and I think it can be a blessing in many ways, especially for style, because there is an element of I have to get this done so I can post it, so it can, get out the door. So we don't have time to fixate on the tiny details, which often actually prevent growth, because when perfectionism gets in there, people just squirrel away at tiny things, but they're not actually learning anymore. They're just reiterating. And having to say, okay, it's done, I'm going to move on, I'm going to try something new, I'm going to push forward, can be really valuable. And it also forces us to try different techniques, because what you were saying about, trying to put in more time, trying to try out new things, do the things that you love. The flip side of that is when how you do your comic starts to become something you don't love because of a style bound, feeling bound to style. And I remember either this year or last year, I was trying to get more and more what I perceived as illustrator type of coloring. And I had a lot more extreme values and everything was a lot more painterly. And it took me like 8 hours, 12 hours a page. And not only was I not liking the finished result, even though I thought that was what I was quote unquote supposed to be doing, but my health couldn't take it. I was physically having extreme back and muscle problems because I was in the same position, working on these pages, getting behind on my buffers, and not liking the final product. And it took sort of a hiatus to take a step back and go, why am I doing this to myself? Because of some style that I feel like I have to do? Maybe I can try something else. Maybe I can do something else that has an equally good outcome, but doesn't take me for freaking ever. And now I do something, it takes me about 2 hours a page to color. The difference is not that significant, but I like doing it a lot more. I like the end product a lot more. And bonus, it's better for print versions, which is something that I'm always keeping in mind. And I'm having to go back through all those Illustrator pages and actually lighten everything because it will print badly. So it's one of those things that I was getting so bound by what I thought I needed to do for my style that I lost sight of what I was doing and why I was doing it and what the end result was that I was aiming for. So I think that can also be important and valuable to keep in mind is getting it done often is better than trying to get it a specific way.
Again, that's another interesting point, that there is an upper time limit to it. And, after a certain point, it's like exercise. There's a certain phase when you're exercising that's called breakdown, when you are doing less than you think you're capable of just because you're doing something new and you're doing something more often. And I think that applies to intellectual pursuits like sequential art like this as well. But after a certain point, you're also going to start improving in smaller and smaller increments because you will be establishing your work in a certain way. You'll be finding the techniques that you have. So that brings me to another question. Once you're sort of established, how do you go about changing that other than, Robin, I know you took a completely different direction by starting an entirely new comic, but what do you do when you feel like you need to change your style? Or do you really need to change your style? Or is it sort of an end goal in itself? Like, do you feel that you need to? Do you feel that you want to? Do you feel that style is itself a goal? Or do you feel like it's more of a means to an end?
I definitely feel like I'm never going to be done developing my style, and I don't really want to be, at least not for the rest of my career. The way that I draw within Chirault, I'm trying to keep it consistent for the runtime of this comic, but it's actually about a year away from finishing, and I'm starting to think about what I'm going to do next, and I definitely want to change medium. I want to do something digital for a change. And I've been experimenting with mini comics on the side, some commissioned, some just for fun, with different inking styles and coloring styles and things, different approaches that I think I might be able to take once I jump into that new comic. Doing all the stuff on the side is quite a bit of extra work. So whenever the day job picks up, I have been having to push it back a little bit recently, but it's been pretty interesting. I've definitely found out a lot about what I'm willing to do in a comic page, how much time I'm willing to spend on shading. And it's been interesting experimenting with all these styles. And I'm like, oh, I think I would love to do a comic this way. And then I actually do 3 or 4 pages in that style and discover that actually it takes forever and I'm going to hate it. And there's no way I'm going to do an entire comic this way. So that's been really useful, is kind of doing side projects. And it has been paying off within Chirault itself, too, because working with these different inking tools has made my inking within Chirault clean up a lot more than it was before. And so long as I stick with my medium of choice, it won't change the look or feel of the comic too drastically. So I'm not super worried about it on that front. But yeah, it's been interesting.
Christina?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty happy with what I've done. I love being able to experiment. Sometimes I do regret that Sombulus doesn't have a more consistent style, or if it did, like, I think it would be a stronger story if I had a tighter plan for what I changed and when. But I really do place a lot of value in the learning experience, like you were saying, inherent in webcomics. They're so malleable, they're so versatile, and they give you that regimen you need to regularly practice and work towards your goals. Not get caught up in making the perfect page and posting it, whatever. Well, some people do that, but yeah, my value is definitely in the learning experience, the evolution of the style, and, you know, every time I think I'm done, this is it, I've got the best style ever, whenever I change something, I find something better, and that's just a really exciting part of the process for me.
There's so much value in just the process of it. I was trying to find a quote from a Japanese artist. He lived until he was in his 90s, I believe, and he was considered this famous, incredible artist of his time. And I remember finding a quote that essentially was, "I wish I could live a few more years longer." This was on his deathbed, because I think I could really finally make a good painting. Just that idea of a lifelong effort to become better really spoke to me. And I just think that style is, the way that one of my friends put it was, it's a consequence of our unique way of trying to solve problems. It's the artistic mind trying to solve a visual problem. And that's why people come up with different styles, because we see the world and see those solutions in different ways. And that can be a really exciting thing, because how we solve problems is often a synthesis of our life experiences and our influences. So you can see pieces of those who have come before, but also the unique way that one person puts them all together.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer for this program was Christina Major, and Ava was our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thank you for the support, and remember that you can help us out the most by going to spiderforest.com and reading some of the over 70 webcomics written and drawn by our members. They are all available for free. Our comics feature everything from comedy to drama to fantasy to science fiction. And you can also join the discussion on the Spiderforest forums, interact with our creators, and much, much more, all at spiderforest.com. And if you like what you read and what you heard in this podcast and you'd like to hear more, you can also click on support to make a donation. It would really help us out a great deal, and we are grateful for the help. I'd like to thank Ava for her interview with our special guest for this episode, Braden Hallett. Our thanks to Braden as well for joining us. You can read his comic, Cato's Apprenticeship, at cato.thecomicseries.com. I'd also like to thank our members who participated in this episode's discussion, Christina Major, Ally Rom Colthoff, and Robin Childs. Christina Major produces the comic Sombulus. You can read it at sombulus.com. Ally Rom Colthoff produces the comic Chirault. You can read it at chirault.sevensmith.net. Robin Childs produces the comic LeyLines. You can read it at leylinescomic.com. And Ava produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
I found the quote.
You found the quote.
I found the quote. I don't know if anybody's interested in the quote, but I found it, and I just wanted you to know.
Good job, Robert.
Read it.
Why don't you lay it on us anyway? Maybe we can cut it in.
It's from Hokusai, and quote is, "From around the age of 6, I had the habit of sketching from life. I became an artist, and from 50 on, began producing works that won some reputation, but nothing I did before the age of 70 was worthy of attention. At 73, I began to grasp the structures of birds and insects, fish and beasts, and of the way plants grow. If I go on trying, I will surely understand them still better by the time I am 86, so that by 90, I will have penetrated to their essential nature. At 100, I may well have a positively divine understanding of them, while at 130, 40, or more, I will have reached the stage where every dot and every stroke I paint will be alive. May heaven that grants long life give me the chance to prove that this is no lie."